Episode 4, Double Agent. Berlin, Germany, March 1950. The cold rain of East Berlin soaked the streets and covered the sound of footsteps. Hans Wilhelm Assmann walked briskly along the narrow street, his dark raincoat pulled tight. He stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, made sure no one was following, then knocked on the door's lower left corner 3 times, waited, and added 2 lighter knocks. The door opened just enough for him to slip inside. "You're late," a low male voice stated grimly in Russian. "Shadows in the east," Hans replied in the same language. Had to make sure no one was following. The basement room serving as a telephone exchange warehouse was dim, only one gloomy lamp hanging from the ceiling. Hans recognized the Soviet who had withdrawn to the corner from years ago. Colonel Kuznetsov, from the NKVD leadership, now head of the MGB's foreign department. "Operation Janus is proceeding according to plan," Hans reported, taking off his raincoat. His cold, military bearing revealed German military training. "The American intelligence network is growing in West Berlin. I've built a credible story of a German-minded idealist who hates communism." Kuznetsov nodded, but something in his expression disturbed Hans. "The West Germans trust me completely," Hans continued. "They believe I work for them, and I've gained access to their communications network. 10 new agents have already been exposed." "We know," Kuznetsov replied heavily. "Too well." Hans froze. "What do you mean?" "Sit down, Hans," Kuznetsov gestured to a vodka bottle set on the table. "We have a problem." Hans's internal warning system activated immediately. He'd been a spy too long to ignore the message. Something had gone terribly wrong. "The West German intelligence services believe you work for them," Kuznetsov continued, pouring 2 glasses of clear liquid. "But you know what? We believe the same." Hans didn't move. "That's my job." "Credibility is the foundation for a double agent." "Indeed it is," Kuznetsov nodded. "But at what point does an agent stop pretending? At what point does he start believing his own legend?" Hans knew that every word and gesture was now critical. He couldn't make a single mistake. "Comrade Kuznetsov," he began carefully. "I have served the Soviet Union faithfully for 12 years. First the NKVD, now the MGB. Ask what you want, I'll answer honestly." "Good," Kuznetsov smiled coldly. "Then tell me about Operation Helios." A cold feeling flickered in Hans's stomach. No one but General Mikhailov himself should know about Helios. In an instant he realized the gravity of his situation. He had to react quickly. "I can't discuss Helios here," Hans replied seriously. "That operation is classified at the highest security level. You know that yourself." "True," Kuznetsov nodded, but there was a dangerous tone in his voice. "I know about it. But you know what our problem is? No one else in Moscow seems to know. There is no Operation Helios. General Mikhailov's archives don't mention it at all." Hans remained calm, though he knew he was in danger. "Paperless operations are common. You know that as well as I do." "Comrade Assmann," Kuznetsov continued, rising to stand. "We've been investigating you for a month. We know about your bank accounts in Zurich. We know about your connections to an American CIA agent named Miller." Hans knew the game had been played too long. The Western Allied Intelligence Service had recruited him 3 years ago. He'd been working as a double agent, pretending to be a German working for the Soviet Union, but actually leaking information to the Americans. Operation Helios had been his invention, a way to buy time. "Comrade Kuznetsov," Hans began, but the quick opening of the door interrupted him. 2 MGB officers entered the room, weapons ready. "Hans Wilhelm Assmann," Kuznetsov declared officially. "You are under arrest for treason against the Soviet Union. Confess now, and you'll be spared the worst." Hans knew there was no escape. If he confessed, he'd be transported to Moscow and executed. If he denied it, he'd be tortured until he confessed, then executed. But sometimes the most desperate situation offers unexpected opportunities. "Do you want to hear the whole truth?" Hans asked, his hand sliding slowly toward his raincoat pocket. It's more complicated than you think. Hands up, shouted one of the officers in German. Now! Hans smiled coldly, raised his hands dramatically, but simultaneously swung his leg under the table and knocked it toward the officers. The vodka bottle shattered on the floor, and at the same moment Hans rushed to turn off the room's only lamp. Darkness descended on the room. A shot rang out, but Hans was already moving. Commands and shouts mixed as Hans rushed toward the door, which he knew was straight ahead. The door flew open, and Hans rushed into the dark corridor. Behind him came more shots, but he was already running toward the exit he'd memorized upon arrival. Berlin's cold air hit his face as he burst onto the street. The rain continued, and Hans used the cover it provided. He quickly blended into the nocturnal city, knowing where to head. 2 weeks later, on the western sector side, Hans sat in a concrete bunker room with American officers. "You're being hunted everywhere in East Berlin," CIA agent Miller stated matter-of-factly. "The MGB has declared you a dangerous traitor. They know you've been our man." "That was to be expected," Hans replied calmly, as if discussing the weather. "They would have tracked me down sooner or later." "What did you do with Operation Helios?" Miller asked, leafing through his files. "In all your reports you talk about it like it's a real operation, but we can't find any trace of it in the Russian archives." Hans considered his answer. Operation Helios had been his personal project, something he hadn't revealed to either side. It related to observations he'd made while working in the Soviet archives, something that transcended ordinary military operations. "It was insurance," Hans finally answered. "I knew that someday I'd need something valuable to trade for my freedom." "And what was it?" Miller asked skeptically. Hans smiled. "Unfortunately, that information was lost in a bombing. All documents disappeared when a bomb hit the archive. Bad luck." Miller didn't look satisfied. "You understand that your position is now weak. The Soviet Union wants you dead. We no longer have use for you as a double agent. So what do you suggest?" "A new identity," Miller replied. "A fresh start somewhere where no one knows you." Hans looked into the distance, thinking of the divided city outside. "I have another suggestion." Miller raised his eyebrows. "Go on." "Finland," Hans stated. "Border with the Soviet Union, but still independent. A borderland where I can use my skills to serve you." "We don't want an agent in Finland. It's too risky." "I wasn't talking about official agency work," Hans replied. "I was thinking of gathering information. Quiet observation. Finland is full of Russian diplomats, officers, and merchants. Who would notice one more? And if anyone asks, I'm just a German businessman who fell in love with the North." Miller leaned back, clearly weighing the matter. "The language is so complicated that it's difficult for Russians to infiltrate. But I'm talented with languages," Hans added. "I can quickly learn basic Finnish and Swedish. I already know Russian, which is useful." The CIA man looked more convinced. "What in return?" "A guarantee of safety," Hans stated. "And of course reasonable compensation for my services." The two men stared at each other for a moment. Miller knew Hans Assmann was a dangerous man, cold, calculating, and treacherous. But also extremely skilled. Finland might be just the right place to utilize his abilities without much attention. "Let's agree on this," Miller finally nodded. "We'll arrange documents and passage to Helsinki. There you'll meet our contact, who will give further instructions." Hans smiled with satisfaction. "You'll thank me yet. Finland is more strategically important than you believe." "Why so?" Miller asked. Something flashed in Assmann's eyes that Miller couldn't interpret. As if he knew something he didn't want to share. "Because there are so many lakes there," he answered enigmatically. "So many places to hide things." Helsinki, Finland, June 1951. Hans Assmann walked in Esplanade Park, enjoying the summer atmosphere. He'd settled in Helsinki 6 months earlier, rented a small apartment, and begun building a new life. Outwardly, he was Hans Assmann, a German businessman who imported industrial chemicals into the country. Business was a suitably good cover story that enabled travel and making contacts. His real task, however, was to monitor Soviet activities in Finland. Although Finland was independent, it had tight agreements with its eastern neighbor. Finland was full of Soviet diplomats and intelligence servicemen, and Hans was like a fish in water in this environment. He headed toward a cafe near the market square, where he was to meet his American contact. 4 months ago the meetings had been frequent, but now they'd become less common. The Americans didn't seem to appreciate the significance of his work. And Hans hadn't told them everything. Meeting his fresh American contact, a young embassy official, Hans knew this one was inexperienced in the field. "What's new to report, Mr. Assmann?" the man asked with feigned casualness. "I found out the Russians are interested in a certain lake area near Espoo," Hans replied in a low voice. "They've been conducting something there that looks like terrain mapping." "Why would the Russians be interested in some random lake?" the American asked somewhat dismissively. Hans leaned closer. "It's not an ordinary lake. Lake Bodom. Unusual things have been happening there for years." "What kind of things?" "Local stories about strange light phenomena. Magnetic disturbances. They say that even during the war, the Germans were interested in the area for some reason." The American looked skeptical. "Sounds mostly like folklore." Hans smiled coldly. "Perhaps. But why are the Russians going to the trouble of investigating it? They've secretly taken samples from the water, the soil. Someone from a high level has ordered it. I'll pass this on." "Any other activity?" Hans reported a few observations about Soviet embassy movements and possible smuggling operations across the Gulf of Finland. When the American left, Hans remained in the cafe. He'd told only half the truth. The real reason he'd chosen Finland was a systematic plan that had begun to take shape while he was working in the Soviet archives. There he'd found reports that no one else had been able to connect. Reports describing something that transcended ordinary military operations. Something that had made him create the fictitious Operation Helios. Reports of strange light phenomena, temporal anomalies, and unexplained disappearances in certain places. At the center of all these phenomena were bodies of water, especially certain lakes, including a few in Finland. And the most interesting of them was Lake Bodom. It was the perfect place to begin investigating what he'd dedicated his life to understanding. Something much bigger than the Cold War or human power politics. Hans stood and paid for his coffee. Walking along the harbor shore, he looked with satisfaction at his new home city. His identity was now established. He spoke basic Finnish and good Swedish. No one suspected his background. He had reached safety, at least for now. But the real work had only just begun. He knew the answers to the great mystery would be found at Lake Bodom. There might be found the answer to what really happens in our world behind the scenes. Hans turned his gaze westward, toward Espoo, where Lake Bodom was located, and smiled coldly. "We'll meet yet," he muttered to himself. "I'm ready for you."